introducing and this next session and chairing it, where we are going to go deep into the issues of stimulating business and stimulating business in a sustainable way. And not only business, but as we will hear with the last presentation, also about how to promote a more sustainable and sound economic system, money, yeah. Not sure how to phrase that in a way that you would agree with, but I'm sure you can correct my terminology afterwards, Shan. Okay, since we're running a little bit behind schedule, I'm just going to go straight ahead and introduce as the first speaker, you may come up and get ready. Yeah. As our first speaker, my co-organizer, Dr. Georgina Tsagos, who's a lecturer in law at the University of Bristol, and who I've had the pleasure of following and have contact with since she was a PhD student. Okay, please go ahead, Georgina.
Thank you very much. I feel very privileged to be organizing this with academics whose work I've been following, and I had never thought I would be meeting them in person, first of all, let alone organizing a conference. So I'm very, very happy about this. I'm very happy to be in Greece. I was actually brought up here in Thessaloniki and studied at the School of Law, so I'm very happy that we have in our audience a lot of students, and I hope they can benefit from our discussion today. So, in theory, regulating directors' duties is important because directors' duties play an important role in guiding directors in observing high standards of managerial conduct and in holding actually managers to account, and can in this respect be key to the good governance of European companies. Now, through the prism of the overreaching objectives found in the EU Treaty after Lisbon, namely sustainable development and a highly competitive social market economy, responsible business conduct may within this context be regarded as a shared European value, and that's where I'd like to focus on today. Non-surprisingly, however, this shared European value has not constituted a driver for convergence, and this can mainly be attributed to the divergence which exists between the national laws of different member states on directors' duties. Now, the claim my analysis makes is that drawing evidence of the EU crisis and the financial crisis can actually point us in the right direction, which is that there's a need for change with regard to the standards that managers observe, especially in European companies, if we want to achieve certain results. So today my presentation will aim to address 3 questions in order to start a discussion. I'm not offering concrete solutions today, but definitely to start a point of discussion on how to regulate directors' duties at EU level. And this is the why, the what, and the how in regulating directors' duties at EU level. So I will address why we should care. So what impact do corporations actually have, and more specifically, what impact do corporate boards have on us, on our lives, and how society progresses? Secondly, what duties should we focus on? So which selected provisions, whether these are in hard law or soft law, in member states' national laws, should we focus on? And is it only directors' duties that should be the focus of attention, or also maybe, more importantly, enforcement of those duties in some form? And thirdly, how can harmonization or regulation of this field at EU level be achieved? So how can, what I mentioned before, the shared European values constitute a driver for uniform application of a certain standard of managerial conduct in the EU? So I'll start with the why. So why should we care about this? So pictures are worth 1,000 words, and we should care about this because I assume we all prefer seeing young people working and being trained and having prospects in developing their career than people that are of young age out on the streets or have been fired and are looking for a job. So employment is something corporations can definitely help with, and business, which is directed by the board of directors, is something which can facilitate this. Why do we care? We care because we want businesses to actually help the environment we live in be a good environment, a sustainable environment, not one which is polluted or destroyed. So that's why we need to regulate managerial conduct at an EU level. And we also care about infrastructure. We care about how our lives are made better. And we care about how projects are financed. And if there's no finance in the public sector to allow this, we do care to help corporations actually make our lives better through infrastructure, also in the EU. So why do corporations matter? Corporations can be considered evil, or they can also be considered as good. They can facilitate change in employment, with the environment, with the community and stakeholders, and it's mainly the board of directors which can make and realize these changes. So this is why it matters. This is why it matters to regulate managerial conduct at an EU level to observe a certain standard. So what should we regulate? So it's worth looking at the internal governance and reminding ourselves of the link between the two basic organs of the company, between the board of directors and the general shareholder meeting, who have the options in large companies to voice their opinions through the general meeting or to exit by selling their shares. They also have the option to remove directors. But if something goes wrong in the company, the duties of directors are owed to the company, which means from a legal perspective that the proper claimant will either be the board of directors, which, as you may see, can create a conflict of interest there, bringing a lawsuit against myself, especially if I'm the wrongdoer, or a minority shareholder can, on behalf of the company, bring a claim against the wrongdoer, against the company, on behalf of the company. However, there again, we'll see that there are problems of enforcement. So what has actually happened with directors and regulating directors' duties at EU level? So there was a proposal for a fifth company law directive on the structure of public companies, shareholder rights to determine director pay and co-determination. And this directive, or this draft proposal, had as a main objective to implement a right of employees to vote for boards of directors in large companies, but this of course failed to receive the necessary votes to become law, despite it having been subject to 3 major revisions. This proposal also contained certain provisions in Article 14 to 21 on directors' duties and liabilities, which however was also withdrawn in 2004. Some hope on this can be seen because the European Parliament in 2002 has indicated that it would be willing to resume work on this directive. And also, in 2013, the European Commission also commissioned a study on directors' duties and liabilities, as it was unaware of the position of member states in this particular field. So 2 of the authors that were part of this study, which was done at the LSE, have written a paper, and they've made a very good distinction between, we would say, 2 types of families in this respect with regard to directors' duties. So one distinction has to do with the legal basis and the origins found. So one distinction is that between common law jurisdictions, where directors' duties derive from general principles of law, namely fiduciary duties, and the other compared to civil law jurisdictions where duties have evolved based on agency principles. And as the authors observe, there's a qualitative difference in this respect, as in the former case, more demanding expectations are placed on the directors who are viewed upon as trustees in the company and not only as agents. And then, of course, there's another distinction made on the level of detail. The optimistic part found in this study is that despite the identified legal approaches, the authors observe that the effect of the legal strategies deployed in the member states are often remarkably similar, and that in addition to this, there are interconnections between different types of systems. Now, the negative part of the study is that there is a problem with enforcement of these duties. So irrespective of the differences between legal style, what constitutes a main problem and barrier is the enforcement of directors' duties all throughout the member state. in discussing what the focus of a reform should be, a good indication of this would be Section 172 of the Companies Act 2006, which encompasses the enlightened shareholder value approach. Now, I'm not mentioning this as a paradigm in the UK because it is in some sense useful, but it has prompted an academic debate, and it does show, it is a symbol of how things have changed or should change. And although the shareholder primacy, as we will see in this section, is very evident, so directors' duties are owed to the company, but for the benefit of its members as a whole, having mere regard to these factors, it's still a symbol of factors that allow for good decision-making, which were not there before the Companies Act came into play. So though it is some sense a window dressing of the shareholder primacy, at the same time it's also symbolic because it's an acknowledgement that there is this shared European value of how decision-making should be facilitated at board level. So then we come to the most important question of how to regulate these duties at EU level. And first we have to see the obstacles. So one of the problems with regard to regulating directors' duties is the tensions which exist between the continental insider systems and the Anglo-Saxon outsider systems of corporate governance. And the Anglo-Saxon model, basically, as I mentioned before, gives priority to shareholders' welfare based on the notion of ownership rights, whilst the continental European one, which as noted has done a better job in surviving the crisis in many respects, aims to balance out broader interests within the company and also affords special attention to employees' rights and their participating in the company's decision-making. Another tension which exists is that between regulatory harmonization, which is something that European lawyers are in favor of, as opposed to regulatory competition, which is part of the law and economics school of thought. So the tension basically reflects the fact that the interests of the member states in some areas are to protect the local markets through self-regulation as compared to those of the community, which are to protect the market at large, which is achieved through regulatory harmonization. And of course, there has been an evolution of EU policy on harmonization in general. So we've shifted from the 1970s, the 1980s on company law to capital markets law, then focusing extensively in 2003 on shareholder rights, again looking in the 1980s at capital markets law, the 1990s, 2002. So at each point in time, there was a different objective in terms not only of harmonization, so not only in terms of how we regulate, but also what we regulate or what we focus on, whether that is company law or capital markets law. And the 2008 financial crisis has actually put things into a better perspective. So since the 2008 financial crisis emerged, there has been a shift of focus in policy, which is characterized by maximum harmonization standards and guided by the need to safeguard market stability. The report in the Reflection Group on the Future of EU Company Law in April 2011 considered whether imperfections in EU company law had played a role in the EU's substantial economic downturn. And in October 2011, the Commission approved a new European strategy on corporate social responsibility, and the most important point being here that the corporation's aim should be to maximize, yes, the creation of shared value for shareholders, but also for other stakeholders and society at large, and also to identify, prevent, and mitigate their possible adverse impact. Focus has also been on long-term focus of corporations, on providing flexibility to businesses, and on, again, bringing back this concept of what is the impact on stakeholders and society at large. So basically, I want to draw attention now, as this is kind of concluding or providing the input into the discussion and the points I'd like to bring forward with regard to directors' duties. The study, as I mentioned, discovers some problems with the organs of the company and the rules on standing, so again with enforcement, and also institutional problems inherent in each member state with regard to access to the courts, the time allowed. So there are a lot of problems on enforcement surrounding directors' duties. And the point I would like to make is what we want to achieve, which is not directors who serve in fear. So our focus, even though we've identified problems, shouldn't be enforcement, but we want directors who serve with guidance. So it's important to reflect on this and consider revisiting the standards and how the business judgment rule can actually work, whether there's some soft law guidance that we can provide directors to show what the managerial standard of conduct should be. And also when we're discussing enforcement, one of the points I have addressed today, I think in my questions, and made an observation on this, is the fact that we need to think of alternative ways of solving disputes and not consider that we need rigid laws and rigid enforcement of those laws. So means of dispute resolution and considering other forms. So the Treaty of Lisbon provides us with indicators as to how this can be achieved. And of course, an important point to raise when looking at the treaty is that the social objectives it outlines are seen as a goal of the Union on a par with the establishment of the internal market and not viewed only as a consequence, as it might have been with the older article. So in this interpretation, the taking of active steps to promote these social goals should be done separately from that of the internal market. And of course, to conclude, because I know I'm running short of time, I suggest that the way forward is a change in corporate culture rather than a mere change in the laws or considering issues of enforcement to facilitate long-termism and sustainability in managerial decision-making for EU company directors. So thinking of reward systems instead of penalties, thinking of alternative means of enforcement instead of derivative actions and enforcement of this in courts, and also focusing more on reports and disclosures on information that actually matters. And finally, just to make a point here, although I've studied law for many years, I've come to the conclusion that sometimes we have too many laws and too few examples. So I think we should try and use the law as a symbol of how behavior should actually look like, rather and prompting a change in the corporate culture rather than as using it as a way to make any group or organ of the company operate in fear, but rather work as a paradigm for the future generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Georgina. Thank you also for setting an example by sticking to your time, which I know that our next two speakers will as well. I won't abuse my position as a chair, although I'm dying to discuss these issues with you, but I just hope that you will all stay for the book launch where we'll be discussing research exactly on these issues. So I'll just go straight ahead to introduce Professor Charlotte Villiers, also one of the co-organizers from Bristol, and Ms. Roseanne Russell, lecturer at Cardiff University. And Charlotte and Roseanne will be presenting the paper together, and it looks like Roseanne will be starting. And while she's doing that, Tineke, if you want to join us up here as well, then that would be good, as you're a speaker later. Or you prefer to sit there? Okay, that's fine. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Can everyone hear? Yes, you can hear me now. Okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. What Charlotte and I would like to explore in this paper is the way in which women are perceived to have a role in contributing to the economic recovery of Greece. And in particular, the arguments that are being made in Greece and indeed throughout the EU about how we can bring women into the business domain. Because it's certainly something that we can observe, that women are being presented as potential saviours of the financial crisis, that they are being classed as an important source of economic growth, and that they are a potential source of redemption for things that have gone wrong pre-crisis. But our argument is that while we, while we of course support this more explicit recognition of the contribution that women can and do make to the economy, and we mean that broadly, not just their contribution to the paid labour market, but also their contribution in unpaid labour that they often provide in the home. We suggest that the arguments that are being made at the moment regarding more women, bringing more women into the business domain, are firmly rooted in making the business case for increased women's representation, and that does have some drawbacks. There is an obvious dilemma where, on the one hand, perhaps we want to use a strategy of using the language of business to engage with businesses and to bring on women entrepreneurs. But there are drawbacks with that strategy because it is an instrumental argument, it's tokenistic, and ultimately we argue that it can play into some unhelpful stereotypes. So if we look very briefly at the experience of women in the financial crisis, it's trite to say that the Greek financial crisis has been a devastating experience on a number of levels. And we heard this morning in the presentation that Greece in 2013 had almost 36% of the total population at risk of poverty or social exclusion. But when we map the crisis and the austerity measures which followed the crisis onto pre-existing inequalities, particular inequalities, we can see that the crisis has had an impact in very particular ways on those groups which were already disadvantaged. And Dina Veu, who's writing about the Greek experience in her 2014 paper, says there are effects of austerity policies that are unevenly distributed, inscribed as they are on existing inequalities. Inequalities among places, between women and men, locals and migrants, big and small employers, secure and precarious workers, and most importantly, at the intersections of those. And one example of where the crisis has impacted on women in a very particular way can be seen if we look at the shape of the paid labour market in Greece. Karamasini notes that in certain sections of the Greek labour market, it continues to adopt the male breadwinner model, which another commentator, Matsaginis, suggests forces many women to remain as housewives. And while pre-crisis, that did appear to be changing, and we saw an upward trend in the female employment rate, that has now taken a negative step because of the crisis. However, there are some signs of optimism, and again, relating to the paper we heard this morning about identity and the crisis, there are signs that women are now being perceived as creative entrepreneurs who can contribute to the economy in creative ways. There's a growing perception in Greece that women, and especially women entrepreneurs, are an important source of economic growth. They're well educated, there are examples of successful women entrepreneurs we can draw on, and it appears to us, observing the Greek experience as outsiders, that there's a growing momentum building with initiatives for women to become entrepreneurs. And for example, the Greek Association of Women Entrepreneurs offers training and counselling and networking events, for example, to support those women. However, moving on to the arguments that underpin these developments, we would just urge a note of caution about the arguments that we are making when building the case for women's increased participation in economic life. And it's here that we suggest that we can see parallels with the arguments that we've seen being played out both in the UK and across the EU in the last few years regarding the boardroom diversity debate. Of course, scholars here will be very aware of the boardroom diversity debate, and that is the debate around how we can bring more women into our boardrooms. We're only looking at women, so perhaps it's not diversity in the broadest sense, but this is a debate that was very much led by Norway, who brought in mandatory quotas to increase the number of women in its boardrooms. And EU countries have followed suit with different initiatives depending on their own perspectives. But what we can see throughout the boardroom diversity debate is that it's the business case that's being stressed for women's participation. It's focused on the potential economic and business performance gains that can be made if we have more women directors. And certainly in the UK, that debate gained impetus, gained momentum following the financial crisis, as women were seen as offering distinct advantages to the status quo. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Charlotte, who's going to take us through those debates in a bit more detail and suggest some of the drawbacks, the negative drawbacks that we have with those debates.
Thank you, Roseanne. Right, well, just to briefly explain to you what we understand to have been the business case arguments within the specific context of women in boardrooms. There's been a number of features. It's quite actually a varied argument or a varied case. And the features include claims that if we bring more women into the boardroom, this might improve business productivity and profits. It can improve employee morale, commitment and diversity. It involves senior management in human resource planning, enhancing the organisation's ability to recruit from a diverse general population. Further claims include that it increases the range and depth of the skills of the workforce, it improves staff retention, it increases the appeal of the organisation to a wider customer base, it enhances the organisation's reputation in the community and its social legitimacy, and it helps to reduce discrimination allegations. This is just a small handful of the claims that we've come across from the business perspective involving the arguments for putting women into boardrooms. Now, to my mind, that's a very big claim when you add it all together, and it's not clear to what extent that we've actually achieved that, and that's where we are rather concerned. On the positive side, the good thing about having the business claim or the business argument is that there is some support being given for increasing levels of diversity, increasing levels of gender parity at least. So at least we can see that there are some ears opened to the idea of bringing more women into these boardrooms. And we have certainly in the UK seen an increase in the number of women, even without hard legislation having been introduced. The threat of it is there, and that may be one of the push factors towards the increase in numbers. But we can say that, yes, the business case has supported an increase. However, we would like to stress a note of caution, because our fear is if many of those claims are not met, if they're not met, then what happens? Are women to be turfed out? Are they seen to be as problematic? It can worsen things for them. Another problem is that the business case, the stress on the business case, doesn't encourage challenges to existing power structures, which might in themselves be problematic. We also feel that it encourages an individualistic approach to the problems that we see. What we are seeing further is that an extension of this leads into ideas about fixing women, making women fit the needs of business rather than business coming and meeting or coming some way to meeting the needs and interests of women. Women are seen in effect as another emerging market, but our worry is what happens if that doesn't lead to good financial returns. So we are arguing that a stronger basis for encouraging women into the business arena, into the workplace, into the labour market, is that it should be built on democratic legitimacy. It's about fair and equal treatment of women across the whole economy. So within Greece itself, the argument is not just about women in boardrooms, it's much broader than that. And we can offer a positive example. Recently in the United Kingdom, we've had our general elections, and 3 of the main political parties have women leaders. And Nicola Sturgeon, who had a dramatic rise to power in Scotland, appointed half men and women into her cabinet. The numbers were half. So we see that there are positive signs, and we argue that they give us a good basis for pushing equality that bit further. But we also see a need for an ecosystem. It's not just about small changes, about, for example, putting women into boardrooms. Much more has to be done than that. Coming to Greece in particular, we do see a number of positive signs. We note, for example, that there are a number of organisations now well established that are encouraging women entrepreneurs. There was a lady here with us this morning. She's coming back this afternoon, but she is vice president of one of those institutions. We also are noting an increasing number of conferences being held in Greece that are about encouraging women into certain areas of the economy that might previously have been dominated by men, for example, in the technology sectors. Basically, we think that Greece does have a number of potential reasons for optimism. Women are often very highly educated, and we feel that women in Greece are gaining very good education, and that's something that Greece can certainly build on. We also feel that women need to be encouraged not just to be economic actors, but to be political actors as well. Context is really important, and we heard this morning stories about the Greek institutions, political institutions and business institutions. They are certainly relevant in this picture. Overall, we feel that the business case, while it has its positives, we're not convinced that it's enough. If it goes wrong, where does that leave us? But if we accompany the business arguments with political arguments, we feel that that will give us a much stronger basis, so that women are empowered, not just as business actors, but empowered much more fully as human beings. Thank you.
Thank you very much for another stimulating presentation, and well within the time. Now, before discussion, we're going to give the floor to Ms. Sofia Karagiani, who's going to give us a short prepared comment. So just maximum 10 minutes, Sofia.
Thank you.
Okay.
It is a very special honor for me to be here today, and I would like to cordially thank the organizers and Professor Beate for giving me this opportunity. My name is Sofia. I'm an undergraduate law student in the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and today I will address the topic of women in business from a historical perspective. This topic interests me both academically and personally, since in 3 days my first social enterprise is going to be launched. So let me begin my presentation by making reference to a shocking report published 3 days ago by the World Economic Forum. This report states that This report states that it will take 81 years for men and women to be equal in business terms. 81 years means that our daughters, granddaughters, will be born into a world where men and women will have the same opportunities and equal pay in business world. We are talking about things that every human being should be able to take for granted. Nevertheless, women have made a considerable progress in the terms of business. They have overcome their socially determined role, and from 1820 till today, they have managed to take leadership positions. My presentation will focus on the relation of women with business from 1820 to 2015, and also why today, in a period of crisis, we need more than ever more women leaders. So, let's go back at 1820. 200 years ago, we women could not be here. The culture of domesticity, or the true womanhood, envisioned the ideal woman as the light of the house, somebody whose nature was to be in home, to raise kids, and to be bound to the household. This woman would not be able, because of her nature, neither to study nor to participate in leadership positions. In the slight case this woman went to work, she wouldn't have the same rights as a man, and she wouldn't work the same hours. This is testified by the Court of Appeal of the US in the case Mueller versus Oregon, where Mueller, a laundry businessman, was fined of making a woman work 10 hours a day. A woman of this period had also to possess 4 values: purity, piety, submission, and domesticity. So this was the ideal of woman at this period. The outbreaking of World War I made women go out of their household. World War I resulted in a great loss of human capital, and because of the Second Industrial Revolution, women had to cover these job vacancies. It is estimated that in 1917, women workers represented the 63,500 workers of all the period. Women in this time participate in the railroad industry, in the steel industry, in the manufacturers industry. But because of the evolution of business, we are introduced into a new state of things. Businesses have now to take files, to record everything, to categorize the annual earnings. And this, the clerical work, is, as referred by Barbara Welter, the best job for a woman. It's because of her nature, of her sympathy, and of her adaptability that she suits best for the role. Even in this time that women seem to be out of their household, the culture of domesticity is not fully embodied. As it is stated by the feminist of time, Rita Child-Dorr, women used to hand, 70% of women workers used to hand their wages to husbands and fathers in order to fulfill their family obligations. This culture of domesticity, from the other hand, may be positive because women are now gifted with some skills that make them participate in business. These skills are depicted in the example of Madame C.J. Walker or Sarah Breadlover, who in 1907 was the first self-made black woman millionaire by developing a cosmetic line for women. This woman stated that initiating her own business was a result of being in charge of 7 people in her household. This time, it's another world war that makes women go totally out of their household and be able to become pioneers in business. World War II had resulted in the flourishment of the army industry. But because of a lot of men being recruited for war purposes, industries pressed governments for more workers. And the workers that were there for business were women, but not all type of women. It was an exact type of women that was recruited in the army industry. It was a government-made ideal, Rosie the Riveter. Rosie was a worker in the conveyor in Santiago. She was depicted as a muscular woman who was pretty, who was loyal, and who was ready to work and capable of doing everything. It was a slogan of this period that if you can operate a mixer, then you can operate a drill, and you can do everything. The woman pioneer of this period is Brownie Wise, or as known, Miss Tupperware. Brownie was the first woman to be on the cover of Business Week on 1954, and the first to enforce corporate programs and the party plan marketing system, where she organized meetings in order to sell the tuppers, and these meetings had also the purpose of women to network. It is obvious, and also this is the example of another woman pioneer in business, Dorothy Saber, of the time. It is obvious that women from 1820 to 2015 have made great steps in participating in leadership positions. Brownie Wise, Dorothy Saber, Indra Nooyi, Cyril Sandberg, Marissa Mayer are some of women who represent the 30%, according to a United Nations survey, of women who on global leadership. In periods of crisis, we need more women leaders for various reasons. Here is a presentation of the characteristics of leadership between men and women. The leadership approach of each gender is determined by biology. Men tend to be have a more in command and control approach, rising from their primitive instincts, are more high-risk takers, and have more confidence in financial decisions. Whereas women tend to be more democratic, to have a more participative approach, to evaluate risks, to be more social interactive, and to work harder to prove their skills. All these characteristics of women's approach to leadership make women the best model of a leader in a period of crisis, because women incorporate what is presented by Bass as a transformational leader. A transformational leader is somebody who inspires and motivates employees, cares about the reaching of their full perspective, and also the success of their company. So for these reasons, women should be in leadership roles nowadays. Here it's a little case study presented by Harvard Business School on how is different transformational masculine leader and a feminine one. As it is stated, a feminine leader here is more affectionate and is also more socially engaged. So I would like to thank you, and I would like to state that nevertheless, our outfit was never a dress. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I'm really, really impressed. I know you were nervous about giving the speech beforehand, as any student would be. I remember still what I felt like the first time I gave a presentation at an international conference. That was really impressive, and you kept very well within time, and you brought a very great perspective into this first part of the session, because I'm dividing this session a bit unequally into 3 parts, which I'll explain as we go along. So, Tineke, we're going to have some discussion first now.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Okay, so it's so exciting to present here that people are queuing up to do it. Yeah, no, we've had a very interesting presentation first on the role of corporations, the impact on society, the role of boards, leading very nicely over to the role of women in business on boards and broader, and concluding then in a very nice way with not only historical perspective but also future perspective from 1820 and 4 generations ahead. So we have a very broad spectre here now to discuss. The floor is open for questions. I'm nearly hoping that nobody will jump up straight away because then I can get to ask a question. But of course, I wasn't.
I'm very grateful to Georgina for tackling this issue of governance, because this seems to be a very central issue for the years to come. As the complexity of the society increases, so as a lot of companies embrace concepts like corporate social responsibility, etc., these matters of governance become more and more difficult to solve. This is a class of problems, it's called in economics agency problems. It is a problem where the principal has his own goals and the agent has his own goals, and these two goals are not aligned. It's about a system to be created, how to develop incentives that both goals are aligned. And by having, at least in corporate governance, embracing corporate social responsibility, a set of different goals, the problem of agency becomes more and more difficult to solve. So it is a need for let's say, a regulation. For guidance is better to say regulation is not the proper word, but guidance should be something that everyone has to embrace. But nevertheless, although this is the need, I wonder if it is very feasible to bring it together with, let's say, market necessities. So in theoretical assumptions, a business responds to market changes and has an overarching goal. This is called profit maximization. It should be a long-term goal, not a short-term one. Short-term can be, let's say, imposed to the company by creating adverse incentives like day-to-day evaluation, etc. But if we have a stream from market processes, and if we have a stream of corporate social response processes, and if we have some other goals together, we have to coordinate. And coordination becomes the focal point of every consideration in terms of governance. And that is something that is very, very important for further research. I don't think that a good solution has been found yet, but we need to discuss the matter. It is something that is very, very important for future developments of market societies and of open societies and democracies in the world. And so, again, I'm very grateful for that. Not very often this problematic of agencies is tackled in Greek audiences. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that good question. Do you want to respond briefly to that, Georgina?
Yes, I'm also very grateful for your comment and for drawing attention to this issue of agency, which is often something we discuss when we refer to the relationship between the shareholders and the directors. And I think my point was not so much, I think it is a very difficult problem to tackle. The point I wanted to make was on the issue of enforcement, that it's very problematic, not only in Greece. So from the study which we saw, taking these matters to court is just not something that is the norm for different reasons. It doesn't mean that the enforcement system is necessarily inefficient. It might be that the process as such is inefficient for business forms. So then we have a gap of accountability. So it is indeed a very, very difficult area to regulate, or at least to offer some kind of accountability mechanism. But it's definitely the case that with Europe, I think on many other matters, we have standards. So we have, if you compare, for example, with the US or with the smoking policy, on many issues, what makes Europe special is that at least, I don't know if this happens in practice in every member state, but at least in principle, Europe has a certain set of standards and objectives it wants to preserve. So I think that's why we also have to think of corporations and not only always discuss on products and what percentage they should have, for example, if they have to have a certain label. We should also start thinking more broadly on what kind of governance we want European companies to have, which is going to be of a better standard and of a different standard than the ones that we find abroad. But definitely these issues of accountability are ones that can't necessarily be solved through the means we're used to. That's why I wanted to focus a lot on reward systems and solving dispute outside courts as ideas that we definitely need to work on. So thank you very much for the comment.
Thank you, Georgina. I'd just like to add quickly to that before I introduce or give the floor to the next questions, that your point about coordinating and balancing, that's the essence of what good governance has to be about, and that it's very important then to move away from the one-dimensional idea that there is just one principle that all the agents must, or the whole board must respond to, but indeed the reality of governing a company in a good way, both as a company and its relation to society, is about balancing these various issues. And like Georgina said, it's about changing corporate culture. And if we do that, we need to address these issues in a transnational and transdisciplinary way. I really hope you'll be there for the book launch afterwards, where we'll be speaking more about that. Okay, then I have two more people on the list. First Sean, and then you.
Thank you, Chair. To Georgina, thank you for your introducing the subject, and it's a follow-up question about how do you enforce it. And I'd just like to remind you about the Oslo presentation that I made on Skype when we first met, where I pointed out the problem is that if you've got a single board of directors, you've got this conflict of interest you identified, that you can't sue yourself, and I was promoting the idea that there's no reason why the role of governing a corporation should be the same people that manage it, and that shareholders need two boards at least, one to govern and one to manage, and then you eliminate those conflicts of interest. You've got a board that can sue on behalf of minority interests, and in addition to that was that there'd be stakeholder boards to protect themselves, and so you have self-regulation and self-governance. And how does that appeal to you?
Thank you. No, that does sound like a very good solution to the problem identified. That, as I mentioned before, yes, there's a conflict of interest. So the board, even though it has standing, won't come and sue itself. And then we know with the derivative claims that shareholders might not even bother. And if they do bother, it might not even get to the stage of permission. And even if it does get to the stage of permission, then the court might rule it out. So this creates a whole big problem in terms of procedure. So I do think that your recommendation is a good one. However, if I link it to my discussion, I think sometimes we're too focused on penalty. So we're trying to look at law enforcement, directors' duties being enforced, but business, I think, we'll have a better discussion later on, but business shouldn't really work like that with penalties, because then we're trying to create a problem for businesses which do want to take some risk. So it's not necessarily, as I mentioned, that all decision-making is targeted out of self-interest necessarily. So therefore, we have to also think of other systems that are not linked to enforcement, but rather achieve the same results, I think.
Okay, thank you for that, Georgina. Yes, thank you, Sean. Please pass that to our question at the back there. I'm just going to allow this one question now before we move on, because since we have a slight change in the program, Tinek's presentation actually fits very well with the other presentations, but so that we wouldn't be too long before questions, I'm allowing some questions now, then we'll have Tinek's presentation, then some more questions. where your presentations will complement Tineka's or the other way around. And then at the end, we'll have Sean's presentation and questions for that. But now your one question before we move ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for your presentations as well. And I'm also very glad that you addressed the issue of female entrepreneurs. I'm also a law student, but I am in a way also in relation with the entrepreneurial sector. And I would only like to mention that here in Greece, it seems to me that there is, and especially in Thessaloniki, a movement, because an initiative group lately has been organized by females, women, and many of them are also students, for providing workshops for other women on how to create databases or how to create websites, on learning the basics of HTMLs and CSS. So this seems to me like a very good start, especially for Thessaloniki and in general overall for Greece. And I have also some statistics here that say that even though in the programming sector there are capacities in the human resources in general, but 509,000 places in the EU in 2015 are vacant. So this has a lot to say, and we should think about it a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that good question. Would either of you or several of you like to comment briefly on that?
Just to say very briefly, it sounds like a fantastic initiative. It reminds me of something that some colleagues at Cardiff University are doing in their WAVE project, which Charlotte you'll be aware of as well, led by somebody called Alison Parkin, where what they're trying to do is to tackle occupational segregation, which is a huge problem for gender inequality. And what they're doing is trying to train women in areas such as IT, where it's typically been quite a male-segregated sector of the employment market. So it sounds as though there are some similarities there, and I can certainly put you in touch with that project. But I think it's a fantastic initiative of how we can start to break down this occupational segregation, which is so problematic.
I would like to add to that and just say that the University of Bristol is also running free workshops for women on Saturdays. Not every Saturday, but periodically. And I really welcome that. I just think of my own children, and at their school, the technology classes, the computer classes are hugely dominated by the boys still. So I think that the education needs to be equalised much earlier, actually. The conditioning starts early, even in 2015.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other, do you want to say anything to that? No? Okay, fine. Then we are quite on schedule within the new schedule after being delayed earlier today. So I'm very happy now to be able to introduce my good colleague and friend from the Netherlands, Professor Tineka.